Welcome to Man Up, the podcast by men, about men, and for men who are striving to be better fathers, husbands, leaders, and followers of Jesus. Are you ready? Man up.
Yes, sir!
Welcome, my friends. I'm your host, Jared Bowman, and this is Man Up, your podcast with the encouragement that you need to be a better father, husband, leader, and follower of Jesus. We're a band of brothers, we're soldiers, we're comrades in arms. We fight side by side, shoulder to shoulder, hand over hand, mile after mile, until each of us has helped the others attain the high calling of Jesus. Hey, today we have a guest. Brian Haynes is with us. Brian, my co-host on the Biblically Speaking podcast, as well as multiple time guest here on Man Up. I went into the mailbag, Brian, not really mailbag, I guess the email bag, to answer some questions from some of our listeners. And I wanted to bring you in on this because you and I have had a lot of discussions about this, particularly on the angle of preparing our children for marriage and how do we help them pick the right spouse and what kinds of direction do we give them. But here's the question, and I think this is related to the Man Up 12-week challenge, which many of you are part of. And if you're not, there's still time to join. We just sent out the challenge emails Tuesday night going into Wednesday. We've got journals, all kinds of things for you to be a better man, husband, father, leader over the next 12 weeks. Check the link in the description. But Brian, this question came in. What happens if I feel like I've married the wrong person? And you and I were batting that around last Friday. We also were talking about how the best offense is a good defense. We should be better preparing our young men to go out into the world, our young ladies too, but since it's Man Up, our young men to go out and select better, to put some guidelines around that. But even when we do, relationships ebb and flow, right? That you've got husbands and wives, they grow and they change. And part of being married is figuring out how to live together across decades. And so let's jump into this topic. Tell us what the big problem is we're talking about.
Yeah, so this is a big thing. Look at the rate of divorce today. It's about 35%. Usually it's quoted at 50, but that's not exactly accurate because it's not taking into the effect of people that have been married multiple times and some of that. But still, that's huge. Sure. And one of the conversations I've had with my kids a lot is that you have to acknowledge that divorce is a reality that even they can face one day. I don't want them to walk forward in life thinking that happens to other people. They're lucky that their parents are married, and they don't, especially for kids where their parents are married, you just don't appreciate the idea that they could easily be divorced. Probably half the listeners now are laughing at that because they're saying my parents are divorced or I'm divorced. Or the point is that lots of times the big fallacy by people that aren't divorced is that I would never get divorced or it wouldn't happen to me. And it absolutely could happen to you. And the point to consider is, what are we doing about that? And maybe the first thing I will say to our challenge here and the challenge of foresight is that there's probably nothing I can do that's going to prevent them from having the moment of, I might have married the wrong person. That in other words, no matter how they prepare for selecting their spouse, they can get a catalog and go through the list and they don't. They can do everything right. That's almost certainly not going to prevent that moment of, I may have married the wrong person. This marriage has the potential of failing. That is a profound strike. And I'm going to suggest that's probably a universal feeling. I didn't marry the right person. This marriage isn't guaranteed to succeed. There may be something really wrong. And I hear lots of stories of people who say they figured that out a day or two after getting married, that they may have married the wrong person. And that's huge. And it's not the end of the world. It's a terrible feeling when you have those moments, but it's not the end of the world. And the conversations we have is a lot of times trying to prepare people to say that those things come. What do you do? What's going to happen next?
As gospel preachers, Brian and I are both dedicated and committed to helping people save their marriages because that's what we believe that God wants. In the beginning, God created them male and female, and then we're told in Genesis 2 that Moses interpolates on that extra expansion or that extrapolation on the creation story of Adam. Says when he brings Eve to Adam, he says, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become speaking of the woman, and the two shall become one flesh, that he'll cling to her and the two shall become one flesh. And so it's God's design that we be married. It's God's intention. But Jesus in Matthew 19 carries that a little further and says what God has joined together, man shouldn't separate. I liked how you addressed both. There's really two stages that we come to this in. You and I have both known people who have told us day one, as soon as we said I do, we got in the car, we started driving, and it was like the person next to me changed, or I realized I knew nothing about marriage and this was a horrible mistake that I was going to have to live through. I think all of us feel like that when we get married because it is such a big life change that we instantly feel like I have no clue how to navigate the waters that I'm in right now. And it's scary. And some people do internalize that as I've made a mistake. The other that you talked about is you live with somebody and you have this change over time where they don't seem like the same person that you married. And how do you continue through that? And one of the things that we've been talking about, and this is not one of the challenge episodes, by the way, this is an extra man-up benefit to you guys, but we talked about in that first challenge episode, CTI, communication, trust, and intimacy, and that you have to work on all, intimacy is not just sex. Sex is intimacy, but there's a lot that goes into intimacy, emotional intimacy, intellectual intimacy, being honest about what's going on in your head, what you're feeling. And then, of course, physical, sexual intimacy is a big part of marriage. And when those things are not working, it can lead you to feel like maybe I've married the wrong person. And the devil's really good at using that against us. One of the key indicators that you are in danger of being seduced into adultery or something like that is proximity to another woman, thinking my communication needs aren't being met. I can't trust my wife, or she doesn't trust me. And there's an issue with the sexual relationship, the intimacy relationship that starts with emotion and moves into sex, that there is an issue in that area. In fact, the two things you talked about it in the pre-show run-up, that the two things that cause most divorces are what?
They are sexual issues and financial issues.
Yeah. So not guns and money, sex and money. The thinking about this, we need to approach this on two different fronts. Number one, we need to prepare young men by helping them make wise choices, biblical choices. And then we need to help our men who are married realize that the solution is not to dissolve the marriage, and the solution is not to give in to the temptation to lash out irrationally. Sometimes that happens. A lot of times the response to a decaying marriage is to become irrational and angry and speed up the decay. But rather, the question is, how do I put out the SOS? How do I save the ship and get that going? So let's get into this, Brian. Where are we going to start?
Yeah, well, I think this is just such a great thing to talk about. We even talked about some biblical examples and some biblical things that we want to consider. But I would say that let's maybe start with the big mistakes being something like, number one, believing that there is a circumstance or event or conduct or something that so irreparably damages marriage that it cannot be salvaged. I think a lot of times people feel like this is a conversation I hear a lot of people say, we can't be fixed. I can't fix it. This isn't going to go away. We're through. We're finished. And I hear a lot of reasons why that is. Some of them sound pretty good, and some of them sound pretty trivial. I've heard people say it's over things that I would absolutely consider as trivial, and other things I would say that is going to be hard to overcome. I'm gonna throw a bomb out here, and Jared, this ought to stir some things up to say this. I believe that there is probably nothing, and I say probably because maybe there's some experience I can't think of. There's probably nothing that could not be overcome in a marriage that is being damaged. That first and foremost, that even the worst of things are things that can potentially be overcome. Now, maybe they won't be. I'll acknowledge that. But we're talking right down to the things that even Jesus said might give a cause for divorce in Matthew chapter 19. But even those are things that can be overcome. That there is nothing that puts a marriage in a position that it cannot be fixed. And so that, as I said, is one dynamic that sometimes people settle in their mind that we've crossed the Rubicon, so to speak, that we've reached a point where too much has gone back and forth and it can't be forgiven. It can't be forgotten. It can't be put aside. And I'll just suggest that is, according to scriptures, not true. We're supposed to evaluate our relationship with God and our relationship with others in a similar light. The concept of when does God reach a point when he says, hey, our relationship can't be fixed. You can't come back. When I'm dead. Truthfully, we look at the idea of the ability to repent. At any point, I have a softening of my heart and I'm willing to turn to God. And for a lot of us, we've done some pretty terrible things to God. And yet we believe we can be saved.
And when we consider the other side of what you just said, when you were talking about when is God done with me, the other side to me is Matthew 6. When Jesus takes that moment in the middle of telling them not to pray like hypocrites or give alms like hypocrites or fast like hypocrites, he talks about in that example of prayer, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who have trespassed against us. And then he has this little parenthetical, and it's just a verse long, that says, for as you forgive others their trespasses against you, so will your heavenly Father forgive you. And that ought to give us caution whenever we're thinking about divorce, even if we believe that there's a scriptural reason for that. That ought to slow us down and make us think, have I exhausted the effort to forgive? Have I, many times, and what we're talking about is adultery here, many times when there is, and I'm not minimizing it, I hear guys, I'm in dozens of men's groups on Facebook, and I hear guys all the time talk about getting caught in an affair and getting caught in an adultery, and they'll always start with the words, I messed up. And then you see all of the logic that led them there and how self-serving that logic was. And if one of them asks the question, what do I do? My first response is always, stop saying I messed up. What you did was show that you were untrustworthy. What you did was wound the other person. You didn't mess up and make a mistake. It's not like you slammed the door when you were supposed to close it gently and woke up the baby. You violated a trust. But even that shouldn't be just a knee-jerk, you're out. Is there the potential to save the relationship? And I think oftentimes what happens, and I want to be very careful because I don't want to minimize what Jesus says in Matthew 19 in any kind of way, but oftentimes what we do is we amplify our hurt and we forget when we are the offended party. And we forget that there was a time when that person made me joyful. There was a time when I thanked God for them. There was a time in my life, and there can be again, when I see them as a blessing from God. I know because I've seen it many, many times over 25 years of being an evangelist. 25 years, many, many times have I seen couples who came in, one or both parties talking about adultery and wondering if they can save their marriage. And you sit down with them and you start talking with them about these things. And what you find out is when they work through them and they can work through the hurt and they can cleanse themselves from the anger, what you end up seeing a lot of times, I'm not going to say 9 times out of 10 because I wish it was that good of a record, but I'm going to say better than 50% of the time what I see is that the marriage ends up being stronger afterwards because they have a new appreciation for their spouse on both parties. And I'm not saying that they're better for having gone through that, but what I'm saying is you can survive it. You really can. So we talked about it in the hypothetical and the abstract. So let's get into some practicality here, Brian. I guarantee you right now, there is somebody listening in this audience who is thinking, I just wish somebody would tell me how to save my marriage. Okay? So let's address that one. We'll address the young people and their need to be cautious in selecting a mate. We'll talk about how to grow and navigate marriage together a little bit later in the episode. But let's get to the guy who right now, that's his need before we lose him because he tunes out because we're not talking about exactly what he wants to know. Somebody's in a marriage and they're saying, I tried to hold it together. My wife's wanting to leave me. I don't want my marriage to be over. or maybe I did, now I don't. What steps would you take as a man, as a Christian man, that are biblical to save that marriage?
You mentioned such important ideas about what makes the marriage glue. You said trust and you said intimacy. And I really think anybody needs to go back and listen to that, because some things you talked about: physical intimacy, emotional intimacy. You didn't mention spiritual intimacy, but it was one of the things to talk about too. And then even intellectual intimacy. And it's all about communication, right? It's all about the idea that I'm prepared to say things, and I'm going to say them in a way not as an intention to wound, but as an intention to heal. Let's go back to the Old Testament. Think about God talking to his wife whenever she has left him and she's thinking about leaving him, and all the different things. God talks about the idea of all the things that are good about staying with him. That's one of the conversations God always has.
That sounds like Hosea. Let's get it up on the screen.
Yeah, God chooses one of the prophets to enact this. So he says, Hosea, you're going to go out and you're going to marry somebody who's got a lot of luggage. Her name is Gomer. You're going to marry her. She has been a harlot. And he says, that's Israel. Israel has basically been unfaithful. You're going to have some children. And that's going to make it more complicated even. And he says, what's going to happen then is that as you go through the book here and you start reading about these things, he talks about mercy. He'll go on to say in chapter 2, I want to give mercy. I want, that very first verse, I think he'll say in the New King James, to say mercy is going to be shown. But actually that depends on how the language there. I see the New American Standard has the names that come out of that. And it's interesting how that kind of plays out. He wants her to understand that he's prepared to completely forget all of the things that she has done. Indeed, he goes on to verse 14 to say, I'm going to allure her. I'm going to draw her back in. I will bring her. I'll comfort her. And we'll have that relationship again. And what's neat is that God is saying nothing is gone forever. In other words, the fact that we used to have an intimate relationship of God and Israel, or a husband and wife, and that she blew it. I really like what you said, Jared, about the idea. Don't say it's I made a mistake or I messed up. I think you need to go over to David reading in Psalms and how David describes his sin. It's not I made a mistake. It's I did something awful. I did something horrible, and it's all my fault. And David took responsibility for that. This language of what I did is right in front of me and I can't get away from it. And I'm so angry about what I've done. And all of this language that David gives us here in Psalm 51, it's really heavy hitting. It's a real important way to understand. David doesn't say she shouldn't have been there, or I was going through a tough time in my life. That's the thing we always hear are excuses. And David doesn't make any excuse. He says, I did it. I blew it.
Well, and
I understand that.
Where he starts in 51 is so important. He says, have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness. That idea of loving kindness is all the things that God is faithful in. It speaks to things that he is loyal in because there's a covenant. And when you look at Matthew 23, and Jesus pronounces the woes upon the Pharisees that they have paid the tithe of the mint and the dill and the cumin, but they've neglected the weightier matters, justice and mercy and faithfulness. He's actually using terms that are associated with the Hebrew word hesed, which is associated with God's loving kindness. And that's what David is asking for. He's asking for God to remember that he is a faithful God. And in acknowledging that sin, he's acknowledging that he broke something. He broke something special, not just between Uriah and Bathsheba and Noah, but he broke something special between him and God. He says, create in me a clean heart, verse 10, and renew your steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me. And then he declares the changes that he's going to make as one who is restored. That's a pretty significant paradigm for asking for forgiveness. This is what truly seeking forgiveness looks like. It precipitates a change in behavior. It precipitates an acknowledgement of how wrong the wrong was. It precipitates an expression of, I understand the injury that I have caused. None of that says I messed up, there was a mistake, I wasn't thinking. All of the excuses that we use But more than that, the survivability of marriage, even in that instance, has to do with us imitating God and God's faithfulness that David was appealing to there. And that's one of the things that even when there's not adultery, even when, as our world does, considering divorce because of irreconcilable differences, what irreconcilable differences really are is saying, I'm not going to move and you're not going to move. We're not going to compromise. And what's missing there, again, is the communication, the trust, and the intimacy that we talked about in week 1 of the challenge episode. The reason why we can't reconcile differences is because neither of us have the heart of a servant to say, I am less than you. And that's what Jesus was teaching. In fact, if you look at, we're recording this on Friday the 9th, that today's daily Bible insight is from Matthew 25. And if you look and you understand those 3 parables together in Matthew 25, the wise and the foolish virgins, and the parable of the talents, and then ultimately the judgment parable at the end of Matthew 25, what you're seeing is that preparedness and submitting to God looks like humility across those 3 parables. That what prepares you to meet Jesus when he returns, it's humility in your relationships with your brethren. It's humility in your relationships between husband and wife. It's the humility that husbands, for us to love as Christ loved, not in a self-serving way, but in a self-emptying, self-abasing, whatever it takes to help her walk with the Lord and for us to walk together. That's what I'm going to do. Our culture, in part because of the sort of the push to label masculinity toxic, one of the knee-jerk reactions to that has become to rail against showing any kind of sympathy to the other party when they don't see things our way. You'll sometimes hear it called simping, the idea of you're trying to make peace by giving up everything that's important. And that's not really what this is about. This is about understanding what truly is important and making peace, because I'm going to give up what's not really that important. And when something becomes more important than the union that God has joined together, then the differences, even if whether it's adultery or whatever, become irreconcilable. And whether that's my hurt or my pain or my freedom or my fear or whatever. So we need to, I believe as Christian men, one of the first things that we have to do to fix the CTI, communication, trust, and intimacy, is really go back to that Maslow's hierarchy of needs that I've been talking about for several weeks and really say, okay, what's not working at the base of this that keeps me from relating to my wife in those emotional bonding needs that are in the middle? What's not working here? Where are we not coming to the same headspace, and why are we both being so selfish here? Is this something that I've given and there's just no more to give and do what the Bible says to do? Or is this just me being intractable? Those are 2 wildly different things. And we need to have an internal conversation with ourselves before we have the external conversation that says, which might end up in a fight if we don't have the internal conversation. Let's give some practical steps. What things would you tell somebody to do today? A guy sitting here listening, I was talking to a guy this morning in a men's group. His wife filed for a divorce. He doesn't know what to do. He wants to save his marriage. There's been no adultery. He doesn't understand. And one of the things I told him is, if you're telling me the truth, you got to clear the deck of whatever's making her reluctant to talk to you so that you can hear what's really going on. And this is in a Christian men's group, but what practical steps should they take?
I would always want to remind somebody, and what's tricky is that there's different ways people are coming to us about this. Somebody might be coming and saying, I can't stand to spend another minute with this person. And maybe they're the one contemplating the separation. Or maybe they're the one that says, you realize this is how upset they were or what was going on. But I think for either party, the first thing I might ask is, especially in American society or Western society where we choose our mates, what was it about that person that you chose them for? What was it that you saw in them and you found desirable about them? And of course, it could be something really terrible. They were pretty. That would be about the worst thing we could hear, because that's not a substantive thing, but there's still things that we're going to say, and I liked this or I liked that about this person. One of the things that's truly important is that a lot of times we frame conversations within ourselves of this person is not good for XYZ, and we're excluding all the things that are good about them. We've just become focused and laser pointed on their failings and not their virtues. And like I said, it could be that it's hard to find the virtues, but typically 9 times out of 10, let's say, I think what we're doing is we're just seeing the worst of things and we're letting emotion dictate our reason. And that's always a bad thing. When you let your feelings tell you what you're thinking, that's going to be a problem because your feelings are going to say things like, this isn't working. And what I'm really saying is I don't feel like this is working. But somehow or other feelings have stepped in and they're dictating to us what is and is not going on. So maybe the first thing to say is, what was it about this person that drew you to them? What was it that you liked about them? If you had to list all the good things about them, what would those good things be? Where are they good? And sometimes people say, I can't think of a single thing good, but typically that's not the case. Somebody will say they're a good parent. They are a good parent. Or when we first met, they were so much more engaging and interesting. What happened, do you think, that changed some of that? The very first thing I think is just what drew that together, what brought you together, and then to have those conversations that require humility and self-examination. What things changed about you? What might, if they were to say what drew them to you, what was there and what changed there? A lot of times, the biggest issues that people have reached is an unwillingness to be very forgiving because we're so close to somebody. Yeah. We're intimate at so many levels with somebody. We almost feel like I shouldn't have to say I'm sorry and they shouldn't be doing things that make me have to forgive them. And that sounds strange, but we do it because we have this sense of I'm so close to them that I shouldn't have to forgive them for doing something bad. Because they just shouldn't be doing it. We're supposed to be in this connection and we don't appreciate that they're an individual, that they are going to make mistakes. And that is part of what makes a marriage successful is remembering that idea and having some mercy and compassion in those moments. And like I said, that doesn't take away from some of the bigger mistakes, but in the end, even the biggest of mistakes, the only way they're going to be overcome is by compassion and forgiveness. That's God's conversation with, going back to our prophet Hosea and his wife, and God using that as an example to say, you did some awful things to me. God talks about Israel as a wife murdering his children by sacrificing them to false gods. And he would use some utterly graphic language to describe that. God would always say, I'll still forgive you. I'd still take you back because I still draw out this affection. God says, I could forgive so much that now in the end, by the way, I'm going to say that marriage doesn't work because Israel doesn't ever want to change. But the point is,
in Hosea 6, right? I wish that your loyalty was real, but it's not. You promise me that you're going to change, but you're not going to.
Yeah. And we have to be careful to say, we're not saying every marriage will be fixed, but the most important idea is to accept the possibility that any marriage can be fixed. And again, I think we live in a world that's trying to tell us all the time, no, there are just some marriages that you just, and of course, what does that mean? If you're not going to be happy, don't try to fix it. That's what the world will sell us. But in the end, we have to believe that any marriage could be fixed. Not every marriage will be fixed.
And one of the things I want to reiterate what Brad said a few minutes ago, we can't address every single situation, nor can we address every single extreme. I know somebody, I can't give you the details, but they just basically told me this marriage is over and there was not only adultery, but there was some criminal stuff associated with that. I can't address every single situation. But what I can address is, here's the biblical model. Here's the path that will work or that could work that God has blessed. Now, you touched on something really, really important. There's another layer that applies to this, and you alluded to it earlier. First of all is, what can I do to try to create reconciliation? What did I love about my spouse to begin with? But there's also the question, what's really underneath the desire for separation? And that's something that I think in probably 80% of the people that I've talked to who were considering divorce over 25 years of preaching. Most people were not honest with themselves about why they were really wanting a divorce. That it was, forget being honest with their husband or wife, they weren't honest with themselves about that. That they really didn't stop and say, here's what we're not talking about. Here's what they're doing that I've never expressed to them that hurts my feelings and makes me feel devalued. Here is this person in the office that I'm really been dangerously flirting with, probably crossed some lines with already, that is wild and new and exciting and makes me feel young and desired. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about for the end of this program is the importance of desire in the sexual relationship being one of the things that God puts into marriage to keep divorce at bay. But this person makes me feel desired. I've heard that from men and women, that they've affected my desire for you. You need to have an honest conversation with yourself. Not just, we don't see eye to eye anymore, and she didn't like the way I clean the kitchen, and I don't like the way that she runs up credit card debt. That's not the reason. There's a reason under that you're not being honest about. You need to be honest with yourself about that reason, because ultimately that is your reason for getting divorced. I've known people who basically had somebody that they were attracted to and their spouse committed adultery, and then they said, now I can get divorced and go date this other person. Okay, are you getting divorced because your husband or wife sinned against you, or are you getting divorced because you already wanted a way out and you had your eye on this other person that you were already interested in? So you need to be honest about that. And that thought in Genesis 2, and then how Jesus expands that in Matthew 19, what God has joined together, let no man separate. It sounds like Malachi chapter 2. I know there's a couple of interpretations of Malachi chapter 2 that I know that one interpretation of verse 16 is whoever hates his wife and commits divorce is dealing treacherously with her. Another basically says that divorce is hatred, and then there's what the majority of the texts say that I think is probably the accurate way to render it. God hates divorce. That any of those, God is saying divorce is like murder. God is saying divorce is like hatred. God is saying, I hate divorce. Pick your poison, basically, right? There's three things there. God's either saying it's like murder, it's like hatred, or it is, I hate it. None of those are good things. None of those are things that we should walk into without due consideration for why are we crossing this bridge. I wish we could spend more time on that, but I want to get to talking about, and we're going to talk about things that we can do to fireproof our marriage at the end. Stick around for that, because we're going to talk about increasing intimacy with your wife, going back to CTI. That doesn't just mean sex, guys, but it does mean sex, but not just sex. But talking about getting our kids ready for this. You've got kids that are in they're not your 20s, they're in their 20s. That I have a child who's coming up on teenage years pretty quick. What do? You've got a son and a daughter. I've got a son. Let's talk about the boys first. What do we do to get them ready for marriage? What do we do to make them marriage-minded men that are the kind of men that God wants them to be as they enter marriage? And what do we help them look for?
Both of my children, my son and my daughter, the conversation is, what you need to do is become the best of the spouse that is expected of you, meaning the best husband or the best wife that you're going to be.
This is what sort of started this conversation last Friday. You talk about two Bible passages, one for the men, one for the women. What are they?
I like to talk about the Job 31 man and Proverbs 31, which is the Proverbs 31 woman.
Okay,
those two passages.
Give us flavor, if you will.
So Job 31 is all about what makes a man have integrity. What is it that makes a man a solid man? Integrity is like the idea of being solid. What makes you solid? And Job goes through these things like, and a lot of them are marriage kind of things. I don't even look at other women. My wife has no reason to question my commitment to her. And it goes on to talk about his business. He doesn't cheat. If his servants have something to say about him, then he listens. He doesn't ever take anything for granted. He doesn't even unlawfully plow his field, meaning he understands that anything he profits, he has to work and earn. There's just so many great things in that chapter that grab us there. So what does a man need to be?
Integrity in life becomes integrity in marriage.
And I want to say that again, what is it that a wife is drawn to a man for? And it's typically generic things like provision and protection and affirmation. It's not, like I said, it's not what men are drawn to women for. It's a different thing. And what my son needs to know, what every young man needs to know, is that's what you need to perfect in yourself, are the things that draw women to you. And we always joke, I always talk about the idea that what's the ideal man? He's a godly man and he's a jobly man, right? And I mean that in the sense that he is prepared to provide, he's prepared to take care of, he's prepared to nurture. That's what he has to focus on. He doesn't focus on looks. He doesn't focus on all these being exciting or interesting. He focuses on integrity, stability, and the things that a woman is going to cling to him for, the things that she's going to desire out of him. And they're not going to be the things that are flashy and showy and what the world wants a person to think. They're going to be things of substance. They're going to be things, and again, Job 31 is a list. I think it lists 8 or 9 of them, of those things that are there, that you're going to be completely trustworthy, that you're going to be completely dependable, that you're prepared to make the sacrifices that will need to be made so that your family is taken care of. You're going to be a nurturer. You're going to be a nurturer of your wife because she is under you. She's going to accept your headship. Your headship doesn't mean you're the boss. It means you're responsible. And you're now responsible for that.
Let's take that, because you said this is what a man's supposed to be. You're talking about the ideal woman wants this. There's a lot going on in the world today that feminism has done to women in the TikTok generation, where women have the 666 rule, 6 foot, 6 pack, 6 figures, which it just blows my mind that it's the 666 rule that they talk about. But then also they have all of these crazy things that are pushed out to them. Immediately, when you turn this around, what Brian is telling you is that's one of the points. What you become is one of the points that you need to be evaluating the women that you're looking at upon. You can weed out those that are materialistic. What is she coming for? Stability, godly direction, and integrity? What draws her to me could be a really important question. I know that was a big thing when Lauren and I were dating. Lauren was I'm not going to call her a serial dater. She was a serious dater, though. She knew within about 3 dates whether she liked a guy, and by the time he could ask her if he was her boyfriend, he was being kicked out because it just didn't click. It wasn't the emotional click. He wasn't what she wanted. For some reason, thanks be to God, I was. And that was the kind of thing that she told me years later that she looked for. And she very gently told me she wasn't looking for the best looking and the richest guy around, which I didn't really know how to take that first one. But the second one is she was looking for somebody who is kind, who is considerate, who is caring. Looking for a woman that's looking for that is important. Now, the other side of this is the Proverbs 31 woman, which we're going to go to in just a second. But I do want to point out, men in the audience, there are some women that listen. If you happen to have a young girl in your 20s and she's a godly woman, Brian's son, I'm going to tell you, he's available. He's going to be a catch for somebody. And I think Brian's even putting money on it.
That's right. Yeah. I'll put some money down. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a bounty. His son, I'm not going to throw his name out. I'm not going to throw Grant's name out. That would embarrass him. But he's a little shy, but he is a godly man. But talking about the Proverbs 31 woman now. So what do we teach our daughters to be? And what does that teach us about the men they should be looking?
It's hard for me not to talk. If I want to talk about what I want my daughter to think about, it's hard for me not to go back and talk about what a guy needs to be. What you said about Lauren is really neat. It made me think that when I knew Wendy was the woman I should marry, and I had a lot of questions. I was shy. I wasn't sure. Wendy said, and it wasn't, you're good looking, you're funny, she said, I know you'll get me to heaven. Now, I knew in that moment, this is the woman I should marry. And the reason is because she wasn't praising anything about me that has any worldly substance. And she wasn't, by the way, saying that she wasn't going to get to heaven without me, but she knew that I would be the kind of person that would be what it was about. That's what
Catnip
mattered.
for preachers.
Catnip for preachers. I knew that if she was a woman, that was the thing that mattered to her. That she said, I want to marry you because you'll get me to heaven. I knew in that moment that was the right person. And like I said, again, not because that was all of her focus, but because that's what she was telling me was going to be my job, was spiritual leadership. And I thought, that should be that's the thing I'm supposed to have. I reverse this around. Proverbs 31. Here is King Lemuel's mother. Some people think King Lemuel is maybe another name for Solomon. We don't know otherwise who he is. And if it's King Lemuel's mother, it's Bathsheba. And I think that's interesting. That would be, if he is Solomon, that'd be an interesting conversation there. But it's a conversation about what kind of woman is worthy to be praised. And it's not, charm is deceptive, beauty is fleeting. It's the woman who fears the Lord. The thing that we want to grab there in that conversation, I think, is things like trust, is things like the ability to manage the circumstances that they're in. Those are the kind of things that a woman ought to be pursuing, is the ability to be dependable and reliable. All of those things. I often say that I can see the man when it says he sits at the gates and he's talking to the other guys while his wife's doing these things, and he's not lazy. He's trusting. He says, I can trust that my wife is going to take care of all of these things, that the things that she has in her charge, she is trustworthy with.
Mm-hmm. What does that teach us about the man that she looks for? We talked about in Job, we saw that what he was supposed to become was telling us about the woman that he needed to look for and what she would desire in him. So what is this? What is Proverbs 31, when we turn it around on itself, teach us about the kind of man that our young Christian ladies, what should they be looking for?
I would say look for a man that values your real value. And that's tough because there's not many of them. Yeah, I get that. Even Christian men a lot of times have the wrong things in their minds and in their hearts. They're just not seeing what the most valuable things are. I get that. But don't make a mistake and settle. Because if you understand that what you need is a man who's going to step up as the spiritual provider, at that point, can I say it this year? Be bold enough to put yourself on his radar. Be Ruth and catch to that Boaz's eye. Here's the thing about Boaz is he's not the youngest, best looking guy around there. And he knows that. But Ruth sees in him a man who takes care of others, and it's such a neat love story because it's both of them saying, I see in you tremendous value that the world doesn't see, and that the things that the world holds important, you don't have. It's such a profoundly important idea. And like I said, Ruth puts herself out there for him. A lot of times I think I want him to come to me. Maybe you need to get him on your radar as Ruth did with Boaz. But then, of course, the irony is, she was on Boaz's radar, but Boaz was a righteous man. If you're going to catch a righteous guy, you're going to have to maybe trip him to catch him.
Lori did the same thing to me. I was more of a stupid guy than a righteous guy, but she knew I was interested in her, but I also knew that every time I was thinking about asking her out, she was dating somebody different. And because she didn't want to waste her time, she was looking for somebody that she really connected with, that she really could have that sense of companionship with, who had the right things in his heart. And one day she just walked up to me and said, are you still preaching? And I said, yeah, I am. She goes, I'd love to come hear you preach. I'm like, let's set it up sometime. I'm thinking she's still got a boyfriend at this time. And she says, how about this Sunday? She's not chasing me, although I love to kid her about that. She chased me. Friday night, game night. I want you to remind her tonight when you come over, I heard you chase Jared. But she did let me know that it was okay to be caught. And that did wonders for communicating to me what kind of woman she was, because of all the things she could have led with. She led with, I would like to come hear you preach. And that immediately told me something about her that I didn't already know. You alluded to something a minute ago, that sometimes even when we have the right thoughts, we don't always have the purest of motives. I was looking at a study the other day that explained how women tend to look for companionship and stability, the status of being married because it signals something to the other women around them, which incidentally is a lot of times why women will try to latch on to married men, because it indicates that he's willing to make a commitment. Although, sadly, that would mean breaking a commitment. Men before marriage typically think about the sexual relationship. And you were just talking about needing to elevate both of those lines of thinking. Let's talk about the couple very quickly, because we also want to get into how to make our marriages run better. And I know you're on short time, but let's talk about the couple who is now saying, guy, I was only thinking about sex. Woman, I was only thinking about having the commitment in the relationship, and I didn't think about how hard this was. Every marriage, there has to be growth. There has to be change. We got to decide where we want this to go. Growth can't just be, oh, I grew as a person and I outgrew you. As a husband, I've got to find a way to grow toward my wife. As a wife, she needs to find a way to grow towards me. How do we institute that? How do we grow from what are obviously very selfish beginnings? Even when there's godliness involved, there's some selfishness in there. How do we grow together better?
And I don't know if this is really the conversation to have about sexuality, but sexuality is super important. The concept of the physical intimacy in marriage, 1 Corinthians chapter 7 leads off when it's talking about marriage. And the first thing Paul says, if I were doing my own paraphrased Bible, I would say, have sex. That's what he's saying. He's saying, have that physical intimacy in marriage, because that is important in marriage. It's not bad to step away from that from time to time, he says, but that's important in marriage. This is something that exists even before the fall of man. I know that, unfortunately, because of Catholicism, there's some that would look at sexual intimacy in marriage as being, some would even tie it to the doctrine of original sin, of all things. But God clearly created marriage to have that intimacy even before the fall of man. In Genesis chapter 2, he's talking about that. So that significance is saying that this is something important. Now, everybody understands that men and women are different. And one of the big issues that comes up in marriage is after a year, after 5 years, after 20 years, whatever it might be, that dynamic has changed. And suddenly there's bitterness. And by the way, ironically, it's a self-perpetuating cycle. That bitterness, maybe a husband is bitter. She's not as interested in me as she used to be. And her feeling as well, I have no interest in being intimate with somebody who's going to treat me worse and worse, that it becomes it starts a snowball effect.
Paying attention to my emotional need.
Right.
Not paying attention to my struggles. Yeah. So what steps can we take to reconcile? Because that's a very real thing. I mean, I see men in groups all the time talk about their number one complaint, and very rarely will they ever answer it when I put it back to them. But their number one complaint is, we only have sex twice a month, or we only have sex every other month. Or for some guys, it's twice a week, and that's not enough. And I don't feel like she loves me, she cares about me. But the two questions I always put to them is, how have you communicated the need to her? Have you pouted and demanded and caused tension in the marriage? And then what have you done to warm her up to the idea of that? How have you shown her value? Because, guys, here's a little inside baseball. If you want your wife to be sexually attracted to you and to want to have sex regularly, you need to let her know regularly what her value is to you outside of the bedroom.
Yeah.
She needs to know that you, not just I love you, she needs to know that you respect her. She needs to know that you see the work that she does. She needs to know that she is beautiful, even if she's got baby puke in her hair because you guys have got a newborn or something like that, that she is beautiful to you, and that her glory is not in her nakedness, but in her service. And you show her that, and it will change the intimacy level in your marriage. Most guys are tone deaf. I know I was tone deaf to that at one point. My wife sat me down and said, hey, we need to bridge a little bit of a gap here. And she explained it to me, and I was like, why don't they teach this in school? This helps so much. That women, if you want your man to be interested, even though I have a lot of women that listen, or guys, if your wife is telling you things like, I don't feel connected to you, that means maybe the back rub needs to stay a back rub for a few nights until she feels that connection. Part of that is love language. Part of that's CTI, communication, trust, and intimacy, that we're going to talk about in just a moment. But steps that we need to be taking in growth. How do I make sure that I'm growing towards my wife and I'm helping her grow towards me?
Don't be selfish. The big thing is
Number one, marriage, right?
Yeah. A marriage is not going to work if it's all about what I need in marriage. And here's the thing. If you can't appreciate that, you shouldn't get married. If you can't understand that you're stepping into this relationship with a sense of, I'm prepared to give more than I'm going to get. I'm prepared that the value of what I'm going to get is enough that I'm prepared to give more than I'm going to get. If you don't have that mindset, marriage probably isn't for you. You've got to find their needs and satisfy those needs. And even if that means you're not doing it tit for tat, you're not saying, I'll do that if she'll respond to me. You're saying, and this is the divine message of Ephesians 5 and 6, Colossians 3 and 4, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. It's not because she earns it or deserves it, it's because God deserves it. And that's what he calls you to do. So your commitment to her needs is not so that my sexual relationship will improve. It's because God said, are you a godly man? This is your job. And I like to think of this is what Paul was talking about when he says, these are the works that were prepared beforehand for you to walk in. It was to be a husband who devotes himself to the spiritual success of his wife, to loving her like Christ loves the church. And I don't do that saying, you know what, I want to see my physical intimacy improve because of that. I'm not thinking that. And if you think that, it's not going to work. And by the way, the same is true of wives, because the Bible says the same thing is true of wives, whether it's it's Ephesians 5 or 1 Peter chapter 3. The idea is that when you devote yourself to these spiritual, looking to somebody else's needs and desires and purposing yourself to that, that's you fulfilling the works that God has given you to walk in ahead of time. That's what God is calling us to do, is to fulfill these roles.
It's almost, Brian, as if when two people draw closer to God by serving one another, the blessing of intimacy that God has given them, there's more joy in it. There's more desire.
Yeah.
There's more connection to it. And while, yes, serving your wife can increase your physical intimacy, as Brian said, as I alluded to before I said it, don't make that the reason why you. And the same is true for wives with being recognized in the relationship. So I think that that's really important to our growth is, am I growing in a selfish way or am I growing in a serving way? One of the things that we're going to talk about in this week's challenge episode in the 12-week, 12-question challenge, one of the things that we're going to talk about is leadership and knowing what, in fact, I designed a quiz for you guys that, in fact, this will probably drop after that episode. So if you haven't listened to that episode yet, take the quiz before you do. It will help to figure out what kind of leader you are based on the most common leadership styles. But that will help you grow. But as you're growing, one of the most important things that we can do is whatever kind of leader you think you are, servant leadership needs to be part of it. If you want your wife to desire you and love you, then be a godly servant of hers. Be a godly servant of your children, even though you're coming at it from the place of leadership. If women are happening to be listening, if you want your husband to desire you and have emotional intimacy with you, then be that Abigail, Sarah type servant that we see in Scripture that is always there for his needs. In a reciprocal relationship, he'll be there for yours. Now, very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, let's get to the CTI stuff. Let's talk about getting rid of some of the barriers that decrease intimacy, right? So, Song of Solomon, chapter 7, verse 10 says, I am my beloved's and his desire is for me. I think one of the things that is a huge barrier for us when it comes to physical intimacy, gentlemen, is that we don't treat our wives like they are beloved to us. Oftentimes, we treat them as roommates with sex options, and that is not what this is about. One of the best things that you can do to help a woman feel closer to you and incidentally closer to God because of the man that she has is you can date her. That's something Warren and I have a hard time with in the Pacific Northwest. Kind of lost all of the people that could watch Will really easily. So it's hard to find those moments when you can go out on a date and have those kinds of moments that are just her and I, or me, reconnecting. And I'll conjugate it later. The two of us reconnecting Brian, what are some things that you would recommend to keep that spark alive, to really keep feeding that? We talked about some of them in the abstract, but let's talk about how do you relate to Wendy in terms of her love languages? I know what Lauren's are, but do you think about that?
One important idea, and it's the thing that people bring up a lot whenever they're struggling in marriage, is they say, this person has changed. Then find out who they are now. When I first met Wendy, I wanted to find out everything I could about her. I wanted to find out, what did she like? What was her interest? People change. That girl's been gone a long time. That girl I met a long time ago, she's been gone for nearly 3 decades. Now there's another woman here that I'm always learning about and always trying to find out more about. And you feel like it. And I remember when we got married, the preacher that was talking to us beforehand, he said, Brian, you have before you a mystery that you'll never solve, because when you get close to solving it, all the clues will change. And your job is to spend your life trying to figure this out. And it's frustrating to say, well,
good marriage advice right there.
It was great. It was great. And
we should really charge for this episode.
Yeah. Yes. The truth is, that's it. It's always something new. And sometimes for guys, we feel like, hey, I did this job. I already investigated this. Why am I doing it all over again? Because it's a brand new thing all the time. And you've got to do that. You've got to spend the time to investigate, to find out, who is this new person? And what is it that they're interested in? And that's intellectual intimacy, and that's emotional intimacy. And to some degree, you can bring in the spiritual intimacy as well, to say, this is that. I want to know everything about you. I want to know what you think about spiritual things. And then the importance there is to say that those become treasures that you hold on to. They become valuable, but they'll change in a year, or they'll change in 5 years, or whatever that might be. And you're going to have to redevote your time to finding those things out.
Yeah. One other thing that I would add to that whole idea of really treating her as someone that is growing, and she needs to treat you the same way. Lauren and I joke about all the time that I can finish her sentences, that I know what she's thinking, that I know exactly what she wants. And there's a comfort to that. But she's also a surprise to me, that realizing that people change incrementally. And I think that's one of the importances of a book like the Song of Solomon, that really teaches us how emotional intimacy and spiritual intimacy and sexual intimacy all feed into one another. And it's a book that I think we labor far too little in, because we get embarrassed that the Bible is talking about sex. The Bible is talking about sex. God invented sex. God invented sex because he knew that you needed sex. God invented sex to be enjoyable. God invented sex to create relationships. That's why you shouldn't have sex outside of marriage, because it actually creates emotional bonds between people that are not going to be serviced. God created this for the purpose of making unions. And when a man leaves his father and mother and he clings to his wife, and that's the purpose of the sexual relationship. So you're not talking fornication, you're not talking harlotry, you're not talking adultery, you're talking about sanctioning a marriage, that desiring to be in a marriage. That's when God says, that's exactly what I wanted you to have. And then he gives us sort of the guidebook for it in the Song of Solomon. This is what she wants from you. This is how you talk to her. This is how you think about her. And I think that's why Solomon doesn't get the girl in the Song of Solomon. Solomon's got a harem. He's got lots of wives. The guy that gets the girl, she's his only one. He's the shepherd out there leaping from rock to rock. And you wonder if Solomon was thinking about David and all that, the way he grew up. But that's the man that got the godly woman in the Song of Solomon. All right, Brian, I know you got some other stuff to get on to. Give us some closing thoughts here for the men of the audience in this Save Our Marriage episode. Close it out.
Look, every guy and women in marriage are going to reach a point where they think maybe this was a mistake. One of the moments I remember was, my marriage isn't just going to work. Out of the blue, moment. And if I want this marriage to work, I'm going to have to work a lot harder than I'm working. I'm going to have to make a lot more sacrifices and be a little less selfish. And those are the kind of thoughts that occurred to me one day. And I realized, because there's no guarantee I'm going to make it. I'm going to have to change. I'm going to have to change and become, and try to figure out what I'm supposed to become. It became clear when you look at the scriptures that God is saying, Brian, the moment she said, I do, it quit being about you. And it becomes, when you took on headship, it meant you're now responsible. It doesn't mean you're the boss. It means you're responsible now. You're responsible that for her and her salvation and your children's salvation, you're taking on that being responsible. And you're going to have to make sacrifices about that. But here's the good news. The best marriage you can hope for, and you said it a minute ago when you said there's where the joy comes in. The best marriage you can hope for is one where you see what God said that you need to be and you pour yourself into being that person. I hate to say it, 9 times out of 10, when somebody says, I got a really marriage problem, nobody says that when they're doing everything that God said to do. And I say 9 times out of 10, there are exceptions. There are very much exceptions to that. But 9 times out of 10, it's people that haven't really sat down and said, God calls me to be this person. And not to say, I'm only going to be as much as they want me to be or as much as they're willing to be back. It's because God said it. Because we haven't said it like this yet, but let's say it like this. The Bible repeatedly says a marriage is 3 parties. It's a man, a woman, and God who joins them together. And I was thinking in Song of Solomon, chapter 8, it talks about the fire that consumes if it's not respected. And some writers think it's talking about God himself is the fire that consumes, that burns up a marriage if that is not respected, if that's not appreciated.
All right, guys, that was some good advice that you heard from Brian. If you didn't get anything else, I hope you learned a couple of things. Number one, that before you start complaining about your wife not being what you want her to be, you need to ask yourself, was I growing toward her and helping her grow towards me? And the second thing is, before you ever think about divorce, stop and think about, have I learned, have I loved, have I led? Have you learned? Have you loved? Have you led? All of that gets into the kind of intimacy that we talk about when we talk about CTI, communication, trust, and intimacy. And hopefully this helps you decode that a little bit. Go out there and learn something about your wife. Why are you here hanging out with us? It's the end of this podcast. We're going to get back onto the 12-week, 12-question challenge for our next episode. That should be question number 4. So hopefully you guys are thinking about that, thinking about how you resolve conflicts in your marriage. And until I see you again on the podcast, have a good day. God bless, and man up.
Dismissed!